All right, so welcome to the Future of Leadership series. I'm Dr. Melissa Wheeler from the Australian Leadership Index at Swinburne University of Technology. And here with me, I have Kaj Lofgren, the CEO of Regen Melbourne, here with me for the Future of Leadership series. Welcome, Kaj.
Hi, Melissa. Great to be here.
Now, I'm going to ask you one question to get us started. Tell us about your own history, your own experience. How did you get to where you are, CEO, obviously what most people would consider a leadership position? And no need to rush through this because getting to know people and their own experiences is part of what informs your own perceptions about leadership that I'll ask you about.
Of course. And I feel like I like to begin telling a story like this with kind of two disclaimers. One is that everything is non-linear in nature. So when you tell a story like this, it feels like one thing follows the next. And of course, things are much cleaner when you tell a story when they were very messy in reality. So that's my first disclaimer. Life is messy and non-linear. And my second one is that I have a firm belief that that the collective form of leadership is what is required, and it's certainly what's enabled me to do what I've done in my meandering little career. My background is engineering. I studied engineering in my university, but I also studied an arts degree and majored in history. So I had this kind of history and civil engineering balance. And I felt like that was perfectly suited to my personality. But I think out of 120 odd civil engineers in my cohort, I think there was only 7 or 8 of us that were studying an arts degree at the same time. So it was a little bit unique. And I reconciled my social justice upbringing and my love of history with my engineering by working at Engineers Without Borders, which was at that point a very early emerging organisation in the Australian context. And so I spent much more time with Engineers Without Borders on campus than I did in the classroom. My degree took a very long time as a result, but I found my people. I found people who were committed to creating a humanitarian heartbeat at the very centre of a conservative profession in Australia. And I spent about 10 years playing in different parts of the Engineers Without Borders ecosystem, from a volunteer to a staff member to a board member, helping this little organisation emerge at a really critical time for the sector in Australia. I then stepped into a role with Engineers Australia for a year, helping them to explore what humanitarian engineering means to the peak body, before sidestepping completely into the world of social enterprise and impact investment. And so I joined an organisation called Small Giants, which was just starting then as well, which was committed to investing in and partnering with a whole bunch of organisations from the philanthropic end of the spectrum all the way through to the commercial end of the spectrum, that was all geared towards social and environmental progress and impact. And so Small Giants is it's played it's almost like a quiet engine role at the heart of the impact ecosystem in Australia, and the tentacles and the contacts that are developed out of that ecosystem are significant. So I spent 10 years doing that and running a couple of the organisations in the portfolio, and helping out around the traps. And then I went and did a sabbatical in Sweden, where I'm from and my father was from. I took my kids over there and my partner, and we had a bit of a sabbatical. This is just pre-pandemic, and I studied a Masters of Economic History. And when I came back from this period overseas, I landed in a context which was utterly disruptive. You know, at the end of 2019, we had the Black Summer fires, which of course lit up the East Coast and created deep layers of smoke sitting across Melbourne and Sydney, and really shook, I think, the foundations of what it meant to feel safe in a city like Greater Melbourne, and really brought the realities of the climate emergency home. And then, of course, a few weeks later, we had the COVID pandemic and the subsequent lockdowns in Melbourne, which of course were very, very long. And that did another round of shaking of our foundations. You know, that really brought to bear, I think, the fractious nature of the socioeconomic lines in Melbourne, and the fact that we weren't all experiencing the same pandemic. We were experiencing it very different ways depending on your the state of inequality in this city. And so we had these sort of twin crises throughout 2020. And I think they were a very, very important backdrop to the emergence of Regen Melbourne, which is the community that I'm now the custodian of, which I can talk a lot more about. But I guess in hindsight, again, it sounds like a linear story. It really was, and it was driven for me personally by relationships that I've held for very long periods of time. So every step that I've taken in my journey has been connected to people that I love and admire, and want to spend my life working alongside. That's really how I've made the decisions that I've made in my life.
I've definitely noticed a theme here in your collaborative approach to social justice, or collaborative approach to social enterprise and bettering the world. Can you tell us a little bit about what Regen Melbourne does?
Yeah, so in that context of those twin disasters, there was a small group of organisations that came together to really explicitly ask the question of what that means for Melbourne. Like, what does this moment mean for a city of the growing scale of a 5-6 million person city that really was facing up to some of the global trends head on. So it's not like climate emergency wasn't already here. It wasn't that we didn't know that we had significant wealth inequality, or that we didn't know that there was issues around housing or health or food security. All these issues were already there, but these moments kind of brought them into sharp focus. And so a group of organizations got together and said, why don't we put together a research program to really look at what this means? And in order to do that in a somewhat structured way, we used the donut economics methodology, which had been developed by a woman called Kate Rayworth out of the UK. She'd spent a lot of time with Oxfam and basically come up with this model that created a new goal for our systems. And that goal was to elevate our social foundations, so to bring everybody up above a particular social foundation, which she defined by the Social Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, which everybody would understand are critical and are kind of a coherent set of indicators for social progress. But she said it's not enough just to bring everybody above the SDGs. We need to do that without blowing apart what she talks about as the planetary boundaries. So this idea, which is much more complex than that description, came out about 6 years ago in the book Donut Economics. And since then, a whole bunch of places around the world, cities included, have started to look at how do you downscale that idea from a planetary scale to a city scale. And so we undertook 6 months of research with this community of organisations, really interrogating this idea. What does a regenerative Melbourne really look like? What does it feel like? What does it sound like and smell like and taste like? Really getting into the sort of the lived experience of what a regenerative place could be. And then we use the donut economics methodology to create a kind of vision for Melbourne, to create a Melbourne version of the donut, and also to create a roadmap of activations that these organisations might want to do together in service of the city. So this research came out 2 years ago in April 2021. And since then, we've been experimenting with what is the value of this new network of organisations who want to act in service of place. And 2 years later, we now describe Regen Melbourne as a platform for collaboration in service of the city. So we are committed to moving our city towards a regenerative future. And we do that by putting together what we talk about as wildly ambitious projects. So projects that cannot be done by a single actor. Things like making the Yarra River or the Birrarung swimmable again by 2030, or ending food waste across the city, or rapidly increasing the levels of trust and agency and civic participation in this place. Things that require epic levels of collaboration. That's what we're interested in.
When you hear the term leadership for the greater good, what's part of that definition for you?
So I think from my perspective, leadership is really about the ability to navigate, complexity and change well, to find opportunities for impact and purpose. And ultimately, given the context that we talked about just now around the crises that we're facing, it's how do you navigate crisis? It's how do you navigate rolling crisis at an existential level for your organization and for our community and environment all around us, which is pretty sort of a down thing to say, but I actually think that's a big part of it. And I feel like from my perspective, I draw a lot of heart, a lot of wisdom from someone like Joanna Macy, who talks about the art of active hope. So how do we stare reality in the face? We understand the difficulties that society and the environment is in. We understand it with clear eyes. We don't shy away from it. And then we assess where our sphere of influence is, what we're in control over, what we can act towards in terms of creating a better world. And then we take steps in that direction.
Now, I think you touched on this a bit, and let me know if you have anything more to say on this one, but I've often asked people, what keeps you up at night? What are kind of the barriers that you think are getting in the way of us finding that common purpose, finding that common good?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. There's plenty that can. I mean, I feel having spent a lot of time in impact investment, in finance, social enterprise, thinking about how money moves in society, I feel really both excited by the potential and perennially frustrated by the rate of flow of capital from what we talk about as the kind of old economy to the next economy. And what I mean by that is that there is, I think, a hesitation to take significant enough risk when it comes to the sort of transformation that is required at a time like this, with the sort of crises that we're talking about, particularly obviously driven by the climate crisis. And so my sense is that that's probably the thing that at a kind of practical level, I could say that it's the climate crisis that keeps me up at night, and it does. But at a practical level, I think there's just a frustration around the rate of change when it comes to money moving, because I think ultimately, whether we like it or not, that does drive, I think, a lot of the systemic change that we either do see or don't see. And so there's lots of outliers. There's wonderful people doing incredible things with capital and how capital flows. And there's wonderful people reframing capital. What does it even mean? How does financial capital sit next to other forms of capital, social, cultural, and otherwise? But there's a lot more work to do there in order to really sort of capture the attention of policymakers, of business leaders, and many others to really see what the potential future is here. Because the reality is it's an imagination exercise. What comes next isn't going to look like something that's come before. Going back to our history conversation earlier, we can look back on previous transitions and we can gain lots of insights, but ultimately it's not going to look anything like what's come before. And so we need the imagination and the kind of permission to do that imagining in order to start seeing what it could be and then moving towards it. I think it's now quite intuitive that we live in interconnected and complex times. So all the issues that we care about, whether it's housing or climate or the environment or energy or reconciliation, the voice, a whole bunch of issues that we care about, they're now more and more interconnected than they've ever been, and they're a product of the system that we live in rather than individual problems to be solved. And therefore, I think we all need to find ways to increase our level of systemic literacy. How is this systemic put together? Has this system put together? And therefore, how do we lead in ways that go beyond just symptoms and get to causes? And I think the only way we do that is together. It's the only way to navigate that type of complexity is collaboratively and together. And I guess that's the ultimate reason why we think Regen Melbourne has a really significant role to play as a way of bringing together epically diverse organisations and actors in pursuit of really, really ambitious goals that navigate those systemic causes, not just the symptoms that have spat out the other side. And I feel like that's now quite an intuitive thing that people hold and understand. And I also think it's an invitation. It's an invitation to really start understanding what those symptoms are and what our role is to navigate them.